Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but you tied it back to beef. Can you unpack that for me a little bit?
Oh yeah, this was just a fun one. So we had heard that Russia was beginning to do rodeos, like American rodeo stuff, and that had been importing American cowboys from like Nebraska and Montana, and on the face of it, it's just kind of a funny story. Like these cowboys in their stirrups and chaps going out into Russia, into deep Russia. And but as we began looking into it, there was this undercurrent that Russia wants to create like a grain OPEC, a food OPEC, because it sits on a huge amount of land, where as the planet warms, the growing season days are getting longer, which means they'll be able to increase production from a growing amount of land, and they have a tremendous amount of water. And they sit adjacent to Ukraine, which is, like I said, probably the second most fertile soil in the world, just behind Iowa.
Access to ports
Um,
as well.
yeah, absolutely. And when the Ukrainian government before the revolution had been very beholden to Russia, they had been talking about creating this grain food OPEC, and kind of going back again to the importance of water. When Russia seized Crimea, the Ukrainian response was to turn off the water to Crimea. There's a canal that comes from Ukraine and goes into Crimea, and that was Crimea's primary water source. And Crimea grew a lot of crops, and that desiccated those fields. And so now the Russian government was spending all kinds of money trying to get fresh water into Crimea, and was also looking at the potential of controlling some of the most valuable farmland in the world in Ukraine. And so, these are incredibly complicated factors, and I certainly don't know what's going on in Putin's head, but what we do know is that when it came to the cattle situation, um, Putin himself had gone to these companies and said, whatever you guys need, we want to build up the largest cattle herd in the world. And we think that food and water are going to eventually give us more power than our nuclear weapons and than our oil does. And so this was a top line level decision in terms of agriculture and agricultural productivity, and not just to feed the Russians, but as a geopolitical tool. And so there's just a lot of interesting side notes around that. Like when Russia invaded Ukraine, I think either the same day or the next day, China announced that it would be continuing and increasing its grain purchases from Russia. So, like the initial Chinese response right out of the gate, the Ukrainian war is a commitment by China to continue with their agricultural purchases.
Hmm.
And yeah, and if the war had gone as many expected, with Russia, bulldozing into Ukraine and essentially controlling that territory, that would have been a very fruitful outcome for China. Now having a very strong relationship with Russia, which controlled Ukraine, which controls the most valuable farmland in the best soil anyway in Europe.
It's a deeply tied, interwoven web. It's the
It
type
is.
of thing that deeply seated nightmares are made of. Just a horror movie and novel wrapped in together.
Yeah, yeah, and it's yeah, and so this is when it comes back to, like, hopefully there will be increasing, because I view my role as a journalist as a very basic one. I just view my role as to go into the shadows or the hard to access places and pull information out and then put it in the public sphere, and that hopefully, in a democracy like ours, that people will care, and that their interest will then drive Congress to make decisions based around good information. And so what I'm trying to do is just put information in the public sphere. But as you say, it is like, based on all of the information I'm looking at from our intelligence community, from the DoD, from the State Department, from what other countries are doing. Um, you know, the American people hopefully will become attuned to this and will push Congress and lawmakers to begin taking this more seriously than I think it currently is.
Would you consider it to be a national security issue?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and that's based on just talking to people that are national security experts. So, like, I have no business determining whether or not something is a national security issue. I just don't have the background or the expertise. But I talk to people, and what I do is talk to the subject matter experts. And in doing that, um, in it clearly has become a national security issue.